I really wanted to not like this book. I just wanted to continue on, just say like, oh, maybe Malazan's not for me. I don't have to read the rest of these, but no, we had to keep saying, just keep reading, keep pushing along, you'll all converge, and damn it, I liked the book. Y'all should be ashamed of yourselves. Hello, welcome back. My name is Sean, and today we're going to be covering Memories of Ice, Book 3 of Malazan. I wanted to take a video just to spoiler deep dive into some of the things that did happen, talk about some of the things I thought were really cool, the background, the world building, some of the characters, some of the themes that are starting to emerge, and trends that I'm noticing in general. A lot happened, so this is going to be a long video. I'll try to timestamp the things that went there, at least in the general clumping things together. This is going to be a lot, so let's just dive right into it. Now I wanted to get into some of the world building and exposition that we finally got in this book, and there was a lot of what happened, so I'm just going to be going through some of the more interesting points. Having gone through this last two books and slogging along and doing research and tying everything together, it's really apparent that the world that's been built here is super massive. Probably one of the things that I think Erickson has done best. I still don't know what exactly a warren is, but I know they can be poison, you can travel through them, they're a source of magic, they do a bunch of other things. I still don't quite understand what their actual purpose is, but at least as a plot device, I'm starting to understand how it can be used. I'm really excited for when we finally get enough detail where I can finally know how that works, because that has still been kind of an irksome, critical thing that I just don't understand, but we just don't have the context for it. Getting into some of the races, it's really cool just how we get into the history of what's happened in this world and getting into the different type of races. They're all really unique and definitely a breath of fresh air compared to the normal, like, oh, this is an orc, this is an elf. It's very unique and very well done. Start out with the K'chain Shamel. Really cool having, this ancient race that's probably the oldest of all the other races to be dinosaurs with swords for hands that have telepathic and magical powers. It was really interesting and a cool take on things. Seeing the damage they continue to inflict through this book, it would be truly terrifying. And one of the things I really like about how Erickson world builds is, while that is such an absurd concept, it never really felt out of place, and given with everything else, it was just like, oh yeah, no, you got psychic dinosaurs that are great killers and used to rule the world. Makes a lot of sense. When they introduced the matron later on, it was kind of horrifying just having her relationship with Talk. And I kind of missed it at first and didn't understand, like, oh, well, why is he just continuously getting injured? Like, it just seems like she's embracing him. But it's like, no, that's a fucking dinosaur that's hugging him and just completely ruining his body. And he keeps getting killed and healed and hurt and healed and hurt and healed. And it was a really messed up situation overall. What was really interesting, though, was getting into more of the history between, like, the Jaghuts and the tianimass. We had some setup before. We knew, like, they were having wars back and forth between these two races. They were back in the day, but we got a lot more explanation for these things. And Erickson did a cool thing. I mean, hats off to him for being an anthropologist, and I'm sure this was in his day-to-day work. But early on into the book, we had these flashbacks into some of the wars. So when you see it's like the 31st Jaghut tianimass war, or the 55th, Jaghut tianimass war, it turns out just to be tianimass. They were just going around and just hunting down whatever children or leftover survivors they could find. And getting into the Jaghuts, we found that they used to pose themselves to be the gods of the tianimass, and there were just a handful of really, really terrible ones. And they did so much damage that the Jaghuts decided that it was better off for them to go off and, rather than build civilization and let themselves be set up to do these horrible things like they had done in the past, it was better to live in solitary, but the damage was already done, and we started getting more into the ritual tell-in and some of the horrific consequences that the tianimass had to make in order to pursue their vengeance. And that's the driving theme of this book. Before, we have the tianimass getting pretty heavily featured, and we're seeing what are the consequences of that war. We're seeing some of the regrets they had for making that decision to become undead killing machines. And all of it was just super interesting, super well done. It was a cool frame to put everything in, because when we dive later on into the characters, some of these millennial of like conflicts that we're seeing, that is putting a lot of expectation and weight on some other characters' decisions. And it's really cool, really well done. I really enjoyed diving into it and seeing some of these cultures collide and just what the echoes of the past were. And going even further back of that, we start to see, who the big bad guy is. We start looking at like the elder gods, the crippled gods specifically, and some of the conflicts that have been set up through just the gods warring against each other. Before I dive into those, something else that was interesting is we keep getting this world is ancient, it goes back further and further. As we are watching the elder gods figure out how to deal with the crippled god, there's even more ancient beings of forgotten races and forgotten gods that are all just kind of paying attention, so it's just going further and further and further back. And the elder gods aren't the most elder that we have there, so there's a lot of cool things that are just swirling around within this universe. So to dive into some of the gods, it was really interesting to see this conflict that's being set up throughout, books 1 and 2. We keep hearing that the best thing that you can do is completely avoid any of the gods' attention. It's not worth the glory, it's not worth the power. You just don't want to be involved in their games at all. Just be left alone, because their attention is much worse than their neglect. And we're starting to see the backdrop of big players of this game. We started out the book in the prologue where we see that the crippled god, probably the big bad guy of the series, gets sealed away through the combined efforts of all the elder gods and multiple other things. And it was a very taxing, hard thing for them to do, but the crippled god, like his name, wants to spread the pain that he's feeling. He abhors things whole and beautiful, and his whole motivation, it seems, is he just wants to spread that pain and suffering to everyone else. That seems to be his nature. And we see little glimpses of this. We have a merchant that's introduced early on into the series, gets pulled over by some of the caravan guards that we follow later on. And as a boon from the crippled god, he had some sort of weird cancer that was going to kill him. The crippled god fixes it, but in return takes his legs, because no one who serves him can be perfect. They need to experience the same type of pain that he has. So not a great dude, god, whatever. But we don't want him coming back, because it was his constant destruction and things that he was doing that freaked out everyone else out, where they just try to kick him out of this giant game that's being played. And we find out that even outside of the game, he still has influences over what's happening. There is a earth goddess named Burn. She's the one who gave Kalar his hammer that could break the earth and wake her up. Cripple god is slowly poisoning her and slowly killing her. And they're finding out that once, she dies, that's not great for the world, because she's the goddess of the world. So if she dies, it's not looking good for everyone else. So one of the big metagames that is happening through this series, we have the main war that's happening where we're trying to fight against the Panin Domin, and we're watching the bridge burners unite and fight them. Is one of the characters winds up getting power to admit the crippled god back into the deck that's being played. This is one of the things that most impressed me so far with the Malazan War, just seeing how cool and intricate everything is. You have the gods, the deck of dragons, the magic, the warrens, all of it's weirdly interconnected and done in a really cool way. And as we're starting to actually understand some of the things that are happening, warrens aside, it's wrapped up in a very cool frame. And having this cool world building, I don't generally see this that happens also with really great characters and development. I've seen execution of really cool ideas and concepts and world building only to have to slog through some of the worst plot and characters, and that works up to an extent. But now that I'm actually starting to get hooked into Malazan, I am insanely curious to know what's going to happen with some of these characters. To get into the deck of dragons, I think this is one of the coolest things I've seen as a world building / plot device in a series. I really like cards, so maybe it's just my bias that I think they're cool. We basically have a tarot deck that coincides with the different gods and powers and the players that are on the big boys table at play. You have the different houses, the suites. Within each different house, you can have the characters assigned with it, whether that be a herald or a king or whatever players that are happening. We don't have all the details exactly of how it's played, but we do know one of the major things is the crippled god has his House of Chains, and they want to put the House of Chains back into the deck. And we have someone like Paran who gets dubbed to be the master of the deck to make these decisions. And we're seeing these different positions being bandied about back and forth. The crippled god is trying to woo Calor to his side by offering him a place in his deck, and it seems like they're playing a dangerous game. It's like, oh no, he won't destroy the world. He'll still be like chained away, but we'll have the power of his stuff. So we definitely can, win over this super secretive elder god that has been trying to destroy everything for a while. It's going to be great. Going back to Deadhouse Gates, one thing that didn't quite make a lot of sense when we were finishing the end, because we didn't have the context, is we hear of people like Callum, who are supposedly going to be like the new herald, or I forget his exact position, with the House of Rope. And so just the idea that we have these different suites and these different houses, and within each house there's a throne that you can have power on. We see, Talk in this wolfed up form way to take over the beast throne, that you have different positions associated with it that have different sorts of power. I mean, so far we've seen, certain people ascend, and we've talked about the soul taken, but while we don't have all the details of what's happening so far, I think it's a super cool concept, and so far this is one of the bigger draws I have for it. Just really cool, really awesome. I definitely didn't buy a tarot deck just because I wanted to mess around and see some of the inspiration with it. And if those kind of cool coincidences or entanglements aside, we're diving into more of the cultures of, this universe, and all of them seem to be very unique and very well done. I particularly liked when we were diving more into the culture of the tianimass, following Tool, who is the first sword of the tianimass, and so he's supposed to be the best swordsman that is on the planet. He's supposed to be the number one, and you're seeing him run into some of the Segula, who are, the retainers of Lady and V, and we haven't gone too far into where they're from, but needless to say, they're a very rigid hierarchical society that seems to revolve around combat prowess, to the point where when you go onto their island, or you run into them, they will consistently test themselves against you, and if you beat say the number 6 or the number 7 swordsman there, you would take his place and have his mask. These guys are so confident that even Rake had gone over there and he had killed the 7th Segula, and so they said that they have a mask waiting for him, and they want to continuously test him. They want to test the immortal, badass, Draconia slinging, person that is Rake, so their combat prowess is pretty crazy. And later on in the book, Tool and Mok, the third mask of the Segula, wind up going there, and Tool gets his ass kicked. And so that's the thing towards the end where they're like, oh, we can't have that person ruin your image as the first sword. That won't do, and Tool has to be like, no, don't kill him. He's only the third best. There's 2 others that are even better than him. But it's these little details. They have the different masks with marks to differentiate what they are in the hierarchy, and seeing those weird cultures combine, and the conflict that happens between the tianimass, who are super rigid and hierarchical, and their own secret sort of histories that are happening, going against the Segula, and just how some of these cultures combine and swirl together. It's just really cool. And it all fits together in a world where there's talking dinosaurs that have psychic abilities. You have just the Jaghuts, that some of them were just horrific tyrants that were ruining it for everybody, and they have their own distinct culture, and it's just really cool and really differentiated. I am really pleasantly surprised to see the different races and world building be more than just oh, it's basically an elf. This definitely isn't a vampire, but it sucks blood and it can't go out in the sunshine. But it has these other things that are different, so it's pretty fresh breath of air, and I like the take that Ericsson's been doing with it. Getting into where, other than the world building, I think Ericsson is extremely adept at, and one of my favorite things about him, characters. I was so excited to see Daddy Rake come back and then just shower us all with his coolness. I think he's still one of my favorite characters overall. Super interesting, super cool. I mean, he's generally considered a fan favorite, so I'm not breaking any new ground by saying this, but I enjoyed him in the series. Made a really epic entrance with taking on his dragon form and showing up and just doing Rake stuff. But where I thought was really cool, and something that I think that was cool about what Ericsson's done in general, is that Rake is immortal. He's been around for a while. He's been one of those big players that have been there for a very long time, and we're actually able to relate to him, which is interesting. You see with certain other writers or certain other series that when you're setting up, different gods or different kind of big bad guys, that they could be nebulous and really far away, or how do you make someone understand that psychology that happens when you are immortal? But so the dance that we had between Animander Rake and forming a friendship with Whiskey Jack, how some of his reactions and things that he does later on in the series, it was really interesting, and I thought super well done. Him and Whiskey Jack in particular, we had that scene where Whiskey Jack doesn't quite understand Animander Rake as a character, and he thinks that Animander is going to execute all these witches just so he can feed them into a sword and gain more power, and he didn't want to do that, so he took it upon himself to try to execute all the different things, and he basically set himself up in a spot where if Animander Rake didn't want to allow him to do that, he would have to fight Whiskey Jack in front of everybody, destroying the alliance. And sadly, Animander Rake just said, okay, you do you, and then so Whiskey Jack takes that burden onto himself just to see, the sadness in Animander Rake, where he realizes that he wasn't trying to gain more power or do anything. Quite the contrary. Later on, we find out that Draconis inside of his sword is just super mad because Animander Rake isn't taking enough souls and storing them in his sword. So instead, he wanted to grant a mercy to Whiskey Jack. He's this immortal guy who's been around for a while. Whiskey Jack's only mortal. And he's trying to save himself from the pain that is of this type of execution and butchery. And this gets later on into the things we'll talk about later with kindness and everything. But it was a really cool, touching scene just to see the dynamic between the two of them. But Whiskey Jack, he's an interesting character by himself as well. We hear throughout the series about just what a badass he is and how critical he was, and some of the things that happened early with the Malazan Empire. You don't really ever get to see why he's such a badass or anything, which I think is a bit of a letdown. I'm hoping later on in the series we start to get more and more about what he actually did, but the foreshadowing and just knowing just how quickly Erikson will kill some of his characters. Whenever everyone kept bringing up his knee, it's oh, you should just get your leg checked out. We have all this time. Get your leg healed. Better get that leg healed. And after the 5th or 6th one, I was just Whiskey Jack's gonna die. Sure enough, we had him do a self-sacrificial act for silverfox. But I liked him as a character. One thing I think Erikson also does well is he can really deliver emotional character depth. And you think after a certain point you just get numb to it, and after a while they'd stop being such impactful. Once again, I get attached to a character while I don't understand why he's such a big deal. I do enjoy him, and just to have him kind of ripped away, and then it's just another one bites the dust. But all in all, you're getting more attached to the bridge burners in general, so you feel their pain and you keep having more and more members of them just brutally torn away. And they have survived so many wars to begin with, and they're all kind of burnt out and just looking to retire at this point. That's why you see so many working as caravan guards. Now that you gain this connection and bond with all these different characters, whenever you see one of them get pulled away, you do feel that pain. And hats off to him for doing it well. If we're running out of bridge burners to care about. Some of the other characters, though, I thought were just as equally interesting. And one thing I really, really loved about this book was just there was no resting on oh, here are 2-3 concepts we're just gonna sprinkle in whatever. It seemed like every different character we turned to, or every different scene we went, there was always something new, cool, and unique that I thoroughly enjoyed. The relationship between the mhybe and silverfox was pretty tragic, pretty cool. I thought it was a really cool executed concept. In my research online, it seems like a lot of people are hating on the mhybe, or however you pronounce it. Just that idea that, you go through the traditional, oh, mother-daughter thing, but having a constant reminder of knowing that this isn't really even my child, this is a weird abomination culmination of 4 different souls that just got put into me, and now that weird abomination is just sucking out my very life force when I had no part of this. I wanted nothing about it. It was, pretty tragic, and set up a really weird dynamic that was happening between Silverfox and her mother. Having Silverfox being a weird reincarnation of these 4 very, very distinct characters, it was super interesting. Silverfox was Tattersell, Nightchill, 2 others whose name escape me right now, but have histories with some of the other characters in the series. I mean, one that was cool concept. You definitely can see the influences of Dune on Steven Erikson and some of the things that he was doing. And when you have these characters that just get unearned knowledge just stuffed in their head and personalities, it was interesting. Having Silverfox be such a weird, not really understood character as well, we know that she has like power over the tianimass and that she can be the ones to finally release him into death. Having all that power put into a child where everyone else is super uneasy around her, it was cool. It was very interesting. Even more so was Paran's arc. So we know back in Gardens of the Moon that Tattersall and Paran had a relationship, super into each other. So that weirdness of, hey, my dead ex-girlfriend is now in the body of a child, and even though that child is rapidly aging, she also has 3 other personalities inside of her. So Paran's an interesting case too. We know that he has the blood of the Shadowhound running through him that's causing him to like have weird shadow powers, and also a weird conflict of personality between that hound and himself. But even more than that, he got chosen to be master of the deck. So he got his own card that he can use somehow that's connected to the rest of the deck of the dragons, but it seems like he has the power to choose to admit certain gods or houses back into the deck or expel people from the deck. In the setup, you have all the different gods trying to convince him that, hey, don't readmit the House of Chains, don't let the crippled god back in here. We don't want him to be repowered to the deck and have that power again, and now he has the power to do so. And throughout the book, he doesn't want any of this responsibility. He didn't want to be a god, he didn't want to have any of that weird ascendancy stuff happening. By fighting it, his body was literally throwing him through constant horrific pain until he finally resigned himself to accept it. And just seeing his relationship to Silverfox, they are both completely changed, different things, and seeing how they're just getting launched into these much larger roles that are happening within this universe, it was really interesting. When he started to think about certain things and having that god had come in there, they didn't really explain like, oh, well, I have this much more capability for knowledge, whatever. It's just like, I suddenly know how this stuff works. And that's kind of a terrifying thought, because as some of these characters become ascendant or become gods, you're seeing like those roles and those positions of power influencing more and more. So he is a really cool character. I was a fan of him in Gardens of the Moon. He was one of my favorite characters in that book. So seeing him get more power and going through these weird changes and convergences, I'm really excited to see what happens with him. Quick then, he is a very interesting case. So throughout the series, he's one of the bigger mysteries. He had run-ins with like Cotillion and like some of the other gods, or the Shadowhound guy, and we're constantly saying like, hey, this guy doesn't make a lot of sense for just being a normal like high mage. Like, what's happening here? And he's never explained it, but we can see that he is a key player in whatever is happening. He knows way more than he should, and there's just weirdness happening all around him. And I was happy to see he was back in this book, but he seems to be like the character that is just interweaving through everything, so I'm really curious what happens with him, especially given that there is nothing stopping like Erickson from just plucking him out and then just leaving you more confused. I liked him. He was interesting, seeing his dynamic with Paran and trying to understand what was happening, and the big F you, hey, I was sent here to convince you, Paran, that you should not allow the House of Chains, but you know what? F*** them. Do what you want to. I'm tired of these gods trying to push me around. It was a really good moment that I enjoyed. So other than Paran, I think my next favorite character was probably Tok the Younger. Being in Gardens of the Moon, he gets sucked up in the Rift, but in this book he got spit back out and thrown into a very weird, interesting situation. He runs into Tool and Lady Envy, who is traveling with her Segula, and him and Lady Envy is kind of a fun, weird sort of relation. Lady Envy, daughter of Draconis, another one of these like super crazy immortals that has a history with Animander Rake, is extremely powerful, and she's surrounded by also extremely powerful people. Tool himself, for sort of the eye mask, extremely powerful person, and then you just have Tok the Younger. He does have some interesting things inside of the Rift. He had his eye lost during Gardens of the Moon, and there's this ancient wolf god that's just in there waiting, looking for kind of a symbiosis sort of deal. Sees, hey, here's this dude that has a missing eye. I have a missing eye. What a coincidence. Seems great. Dude. And so as we're going through like the series, we find that he has some sort of like connection to this like wolf that allows him to see other things, but he's still not like the other characters. Like, he's not an ascendant. He's not some like masterful warrior. He's going deep into enemy territory with all these really strong, really capable characters, and he is just one fleshy bag. But so the relationship between like Tok and Lady Envy was interesting. Tok is just a very mortal man who, while having some weird connection to this ancient wolf thing, doesn't have any of the power or stuff to share through it. Well, Lady Envy is someone who ran with like Animander Rake, and her father's Draconis, very powerful. She has traveled with these most powerful swordsmen you can find around and had completely control over them mentally. And so you just kind of like constantly have this weird kind of relationship that's happening where she's very much into Talk, and Talk is just terrified shitless, as he should be. So that was fun, but as we go through the series, we just see like Talk getting into shittier and shittier situations. I actually didn't catch how horrific it was when he finally met the seer and got left into the loving care of the matron. I just was like, this is weird. And then I sat back and started thinking about it. I was like, why is he so injured? Like, that doesn't make sense. Like, he's being cared for by the matron. That sounds nice. And then I go back, realize the matron is actually, one of those dinosaurs with sword arms that are telepathic. That's just in her affections or care, just is constantly crushing him and healing him and crushing him and healing. And he's not healing just right. It's just more like break a bone and then it heals in that weird, messed up position. So really horrifying. And then seeing him transcend like and escape that suffering was really cool. I thought they were going to keep him as sort of this weird hybrid wolf god thing, but seeing him get a second chance by taking over one of the empty shells that Itkovian left was really interesting. And I'm excited to see what happens with him in the future, but just personality-wise, he was one of my favorites to read. His relationship with Tool, too, was cool. Tool was an amazing character, and I was really happy that he's put into this series. Like, I really enjoyed him, and having that window into the tianimass culture and just seeing what they were actually like, and just in general, just a badass zombie sword warrior. It's like, what's not to like? And lastly, I guess there's one character that everyone either loves or hates, but I'm pretty neutral on, and that's Kruppe. I like some of the pageantry and stuff that he does, but most of the time when he's on there, it's like I find myself glazing over. Maybe it's just because of the sheer information dump, but one thing in particular that I actually really enjoyed, or the interaction was between him and Kalar, was that he had just pissed off Kalar so much that he took his hammer that was given to him by Burn that could literally break the world at a random chance. Like, every time he swings it, there's a chance that Burn could wake up and destroy everything. And Kruppe pisses him so off that he just starts swinging it and trying to kill him, just knowing that every swing he takes could completely end the world. That's how much that Kruppe pissed him off. And the weirdness is you have this like really ancient dude with all this great power and then can't hit Kruppe. So a lot that's happening with him. He's a very interesting character. I'm curious to see what it's revealed he actually is, the role he takes later on there. But I don't have strong opinions on him one way or the other. I've heard character relations to him like it's kind of like a Lift from the Stormlight Archives, and I like Lift. Maybe it's just because so much is happening that his brevity or whatever doesn't quite land as hard as it would for a different circumstance. He's entertaining, so I have no complaints for him. So lastly, I wanted to talk about some of the themes and trends I've noticed in this book and this series as a whole, but to get into it, let's talk about the Panin Domin. Now, they were set up as the enemies of this book, and honestly, for the first half of the book, I really didn't see them as any other than like, oh, well, I guess they're opposing the views, like, Malazan, no good guys or bad guys. And then we got into the Children of the Dead Seed and Tenascari. I feel like whenever you start having, cannibal necrophiliacs, that automatically anyone who is opposing them, they are the good guys. And it's a personal rule. It's just it's hard to justify the morality of the situation when you're eating people and then having sex for their bodies. It's not great. But, we find out that these people have been led by the seer, who turns out not even to be the actual seer. It is a Jaghut in disguise that's hiding, but that Jaghut is suffering immensely. It's being influenced by the crippled god, and does that mean that its actions are under its control, or are they responsible for something else? And throughout all of this, one of the things that we learned in this book is the tianimass just hate the Jaghut so much, where even for them, it's like given the option between finally getting released from their suffering and killing more Jaghut. They're like, it's time to kill some more Jaghut, I can suffer some more. But in these battle against these cannibals and really terrible people, it's like they are doing really horrific things. They deserve whatever happens to them. But we find that some of the guys that are more turning into good guys, they are instead practicing mercy and compassion. The instance of Animander Rake, trying to save Whiskey Jack, the suffering and sadness that comes from executing those witches in public. We're getting more of these set up, or even though these are very terrible things, and in the past they have done like absolutely horrific, horrendous things, that there is still room for forgiveness. And one of the best characters that I think so far has really shown this was Itkovian. He was a cool character. I didn't really get him at first, but then we started getting into more of the shield anvil stuff. I mean, he's set up where it's like, oh well, everything here has either cool names or cool titles. Shield anvil sounds like we're just giving to him. And then he proceeds to take on like everyone's sadness and suffering onto themselves to relieve it from them. And as he's interacting with the Panin and Domin and these type of things, they're so afraid of them having their suffering removed from them, because for them that's the only thing they have left. The cruelty, suffering, and just sheer hatred is the only thing they have left within themselves. So having someone like Itkovian come in and take that away from them horrifies them, because then suddenly they have nothing left to exist for. That's the only thing that's driving them and animating them, and Itkovian wants to grant them that mercy, just letting it go. As we go on, silverfox, she came through, and she had a weird connection to the tianimass, where she was the one who was going to release them from their suffering. And we found that, hey, the thing that you're supposed to do and release them and stuff, it's like, no, you just want to keep using them for your own ends. But then you have guys like Itkovian come in, and rather than it saving the day and like letting it last longer for the tianimass to come in and defeat the Panin and Domin, our good guy forces are suffering horribly in the war. He decides that without the help of his god, and without anything to combat from the sheer amount of suffering and wrath that's about to happen, he takes on the entire race of tianimass, like suffering, onto himself to relieve them of it. And it's so much, and he dies in the process. But it was like through that effort of kindness and just like, hey, I know I'm not going to make it there, but this is what I do, and I'm going to be kind regardless. It was just a really cool, beautiful moment. That when I keep hearing that these are the themes, and there's that argument of, is Malazan grimdark? No, because of the theme of kindness. It's like, okay, I'm starting to see some more actual merit for these arguments. I'd still consider it grimdark, but it's definitely a thing where they had every reason to be cruel to these people, and instead we are choosing the kind route. And with the end of the book, with the jacket, it's under the influence of Mad God, but for the tianimass, they would absolutely just decide that every jacket should suffer for the sins of the tyrants. And instead, they take it upon themselves to like release from there and try to help them out. They take the jacket with the thinnest and wind up trying to use that to help Burns poisoning in the sleep. There are so many particular instances and scenes that happen in this book where the answer in a lot of other books would have been just like, no, sheer vengeance, we're going to kick ass, and it's going to be like, you shouldn't have made those decisions. You're going to get punished for those decisions. And instead, you see these characters taking, the higher road, being self-sacrificial, actually going out on a limb for each other. And it's a cool thing, for something this dark and epic and so many characters dying, to have this being the theme that's recurring through it is a really amazing, cool convergence of things. And speaking of that, my other trend/theme, it's just how cool some of the things that happen. I really like Gruntle in this book. One, I really liked his attitude around everything, just having seen so much and then just not taking it any too seriously, only to have him become the mortal sword of Dreech. And later on, when he's in that battle and he kind of becomes a tiger man, he's fighting with this squad and they all conform into a giant tiger, and then you see get hit by an enemy and you just see the tiger have people flying out of it. It was just such an absurd anime level thing that was really cool, and just you're seeing more of that. You have these cool positions, you have these epic moments, the deck of dragons, the gods, the heralds, just all the weird little convergences and little details that Erickson just piled through all of it. I just find it really fascinating and really fun just to read through. So that was a lot. I apologize for the unorganized ramble, but with these books, it's definitely a test of my booktubing/review ability, because I don't want to just be I liked it, I disliked it, whatever. I like to dive into these books and talk about some of the things I enjoyed and didn't. But with these books, so much happened that it's really hard just to keep every segment together. In my last video, I was like, one of the things that I couldn't decide if I liked or disliked was just how many times you had to reread it to understand everything. And you have like Critical Dragon, who like will go line by line and just dissect every little thing that's in there and how it ties into the rest of the series. And it makes sense why you are able to do videos like that, because so much is just shoved in there, it's hard to dissect and put together. And I realized I missed like a good portion of this book in certain scenes and didn't even really talk about the overarching plot, but I think I'm just going to have to just continue pushing through it. Once I get the read through going, I'll probably go back and make more content around Malazan, but for now it's just I need to understand the series as a whole and just push through it. And just once I have everything click in place, I'll definitely come back and continue to make videos along these veins. But hey, I appreciate you guys stopping around and watching this long. This was definitely a longer video. Thanks for sticking around. I will start reading Midnight Tides pretty shortly. I hopefully can get another one of these out of this year, but I actually have some non-review or shitpost related content that is on the horizon, so keep tuned, check it out. But as always, thanks for watching.